The Lawson Mansion, a true palace of marble and glass, rests atop the hills of Seoul. Majestic and silent, it reflects its sole resident, Richard Lawson, a billionaire who, at 58, lives trapped in grief and memories of a lost love. The hallways echo his solitary footsteps, the walls are adorned with expensive art, but they lack something that even money cannot buy: life. Richard wakes up early, as usual, but not out of enthusiasm for the day ahead. He puts on an impeccable suit, drinks his tea, a cup of black tea with no sugar, and flips through the newspaper, more out of habit than genuine interest. In the corner of the room stands a photo of Emily, his late wife, which he has never been able to remove. His gaze frequently falls on the image, as if waiting for an answer that will never come. In the business world, Richard is a man of quick, cold decisions. But when it comes to matters of the heart, he is stagnant. For 22 years, since Emily passed away in a car accident, he has lived amidst memories and regrets. Every year on the anniversary of Emily's death, Richard visits the cemetery where she was buried. He brings white roses, her favorite flowers, and spends hours in silence before the grave, reflecting on the moments they shared together. This morning, as he arrives at the cemetery, the sky is overcast, as if mirroring his state of mind. He walks slowly to the grave, the sound of dry leaves crunching under his feet echoing in the air. "I still miss you," he murmurs, placing the flowers on the headstone. The wind blows gently, as if it were the only reply he could receive. Emily's grave is simple yet elegant, with an inscription that reads, "Forever loved, forever remembered." Richard remains there, motionless, immersed in memories of Emily. He recalls her smile, her soft laughter, and the way she always said he was capable of achieving the impossible. Yet, in his thoughts, he is also haunted by the arguments they had in the months before her death, conversations he never had the chance to make right. A few kilometers away, in a small, modest apartment, Sophie struggles to manage her routine as a single mother. At 27 years old, she divides her time between temporary jobs and caring for her son Daniel, a baby just a year and a half old. Sophie's morning is hectic. She places Daniel in an improvised high chair in the kitchen while trying to prepare a simple porridge. "Just a little longer, sweetheart. Mommy's almost done," she says, as little Daniel taps his hands impatiently on the table. The sound of childish giggles echoes through the apartment, but an underlying tension remains. Sophie looks out the window, watching the gray sky and wondering how she will manage to pay the rent at the end of the month. She picks up her wallet, which holds only a few crumpled bills and coins. "It will work out," she whispers to herself, trying to muster some confidence. After feeding Daniel, Sophie dresses him in a thick jacket. She places the boy in his stroller and heads out to face the world, uncertain of what the day will bring. Back at the mansion, Richard returns from the cemetery and attempts to focus on work, but something prevents him. He walks to his study and retrieves an old box of memories, one he hasn't opened in years. Inside are photos of Emily, love notes they exchanged in the early years of their marriage, and even movie tickets. Among the items, he finds a carefully folded letter written by Emily. As he opens it, time seems to stop. Her delicate handwriting transports him back to a time when they still dreamed together. The letter speaks of plans for the future, of her desire to build a family. "Why didn't we ever talk about this?" he asks aloud, overwhelmed by regret. At the end of the day, as Richard tries to escape his thoughts with a glass of wine in hand, the television hums in the background, broadcasting a report on social inequality in Seoul. The image of a woman in the rain, holding a baby, catches his attention for a brief moment. He turns off the TV before fully processing what he saw, but the feeling of unease lingers. Richard tries to resume his routine the next day, but a sense of discomfort lingers. The unease he felt while visiting Emily's grave seems to have intensified. He walks around the house, trying to occupy his mind with work, but constantly finds himself staring out the window, lost in thought. The mansion, with its vast library and artwork adorning the corridors, was once a symbol of success for him. Now, it is merely a reminder of all he has lost. He recalls Emily's words spoken years ago. "You built an empire, Richard, but what about our world?" Those words haunt him like an echo, especially now, when he feels more disconnected than ever. Meanwhile, Sophie faces a day filled with difficult decisions. With her money running out, she realizes she needs to find an immediate solution to feed Daniel. She grabs an old backpack and packs the little she has: a bottle of water, an extra diaper, and a small blanket for the baby. As night falls, Sophie finds herself on the street, pushing Daniel's stroller as she braces against the biting cold. Rain begins to fall, and she stops at a busy spot where people hurry past. Hesitant, she pulls out a small piece of paper on which she has written by hand, "Please help my baby." Minutes feel like hours as she tries to hold the sign with her trembling hands. Many people walk by without even glancing at her, but Sophie persists. The rain soaks through her clothes, and Daniel begins to cry softly, bothered by the cold. At that moment, a luxurious black car stops at the nearby traffic light. Inside the vehicle, Richard observes the scene, intrigued. He sees Sophie, drenched and visibly exhausted, holding the sign while shielding the baby with her body. Something in her eyes deeply moves him. When the light turns green, Richard hesitates for a moment before turning to the driver. "Stop here." The driver obeys, and Richard steps out of the car. He approaches Sophie with slow steps, trying to understand what is happening. "Are you all right?" he asks, his voice calm but firm. Sophie looks at him, surprised, but answers honestly. "No, my baby is hungry, and I have nowhere else to go." Richard takes out his wallet and pulls out some bills. He hands them to Sophie, trying to be as discreet as possible. "Take this. Use it for whatever you need." Sophie hesitates, but her need outweighs her pride. "Thank you." "Thank you so much," she replies, almost breathless. Richard nods slightly and returns to the car without saying another word. In the back seat, he looks out the window as the vehicle drives away, feeling a mixture of relief and something deeper that he cannot explain. Sophie, still surprised by the unexpected kindness, carefully stores the money and begins to walk toward a small nearby market. She wonders if that moment was a stroke of luck, or perhaps something more. Later that night, Richard cannot forget the scene he witnessed. As he sips his usual black tea in the living room, he wonders who that woman was and what had brought her to such a situation. He feels restless, as if something inside him has shifted. That same night, Sophie puts Daniel to bed after feeding him. She holds the old photo of Emily, which she treasures, and whispers, "Maybe, in some way, you're still watching over me." As the city lights fade, fate begins to move its pieces, connecting two lives burdened with pain and secrets that are about to be revealed. The next day, Richard wakes up early, but not out of habit. The image of the young mother in the rain, holding her baby, still lingers in his mind. While drinking his tea, he stares at Emily's photo in his room, as if seeking answers for the restlessness he feels. Something about that woman's gaze reminded him of Emily, but he can't quite understand why. Unable to focus, Richard decides to return to the cemetery. He rarely does this outside his annual ritual, but he feels drawn back there. Perhaps it's his thoughts of Emily, or perhaps it's simply a need to clear his mind. Meanwhile, Sophie tries to navigate the weight of her decisions from the previous day. With the money she received, she was able to feed Daniel and buy some essentials. Yet the shame and fear of not knowing what the future holds leave her uneasy. Determined to find answers, Sophie takes the only photo she has of Emily and places it in her backpack. She knows that Emily holds the key to understanding her own story. But even with that realization, Sophie still doesn't know how to approach the man who helped her the night before, the one who offered aid without asking questions. At the cemetery, Richard walks toward Emily's grave, but suddenly stops when he sees someone in the distance. He recognizes the figure. It's Sophie, the same woman he met in the rain. Richard feels a wave of surprise and curiosity. He watches as she kneels before a nearby grave. It's not Emily's, but it's close enough to stir a series of questions. He hesitates for a moment but decides to approach. Sophie doesn't notice his presence until he speaks. "You again?" She turns quickly, holding Daniel tighter, clearly startled and a little uncomfortable. "Sir?" she begins, struggling to find the right words. I didn't expect to see you here." Richard crosses his arms, observing her closely. "You don't seem like someone who frequents this place without reason. What brings you here?" Sophie looks at the ground, hesitant. Finally, she takes a deep breath and answers, "I came to visit someone." Richard looks at the grave in front of her, frowning. The name on the headstone is unfamiliar to him, but something in her expression makes him want to know more. Is this someone important to you? He asks. Very, Sophie replies, her voice soft but filled with emotion. A silence falls between them. Richard senses that something is left unsaid, but decides not to push her at that moment. Are you all right? After yesterday, I mean. Yes, thank you. The money helped a lot. I don't know how to thank you. Richard waves his hand dismissively, as if to end the subject. There's no need to thank me. I'm just surprised to see you here. Sophie seems about to say something, but she hesitates again. She reaches into her backpack and pulls out Emily's photo, holding it carefully. I think you need to see this. Richard watches as she hands him the photo. When he looks at it, his expression changes instantly. He recognizes Emily, but the context confuses him. Where did you get this? He asks, his voice firmer now. Sophie lowers her gaze as if trying to avoid the weight of the question. It's a long story. Then start telling it, Richard insists, crossing his arms. Sophie takes a deep breath and begins to explain. I never met my mother. She left me when I was a baby. Everything I know about her comes from the stories I've heard from other people and from this photo. Richard feels the ground disappear beneath his feet. He looks at the photo again, trying to understand how Emily could be connected to Sophie. Your mother was Emily? He asks, barely believing the words leaving his mouth. Sophie nods slowly, her eyes welling with tears. Yes. Richard's world seems to collapse in that instant. He takes a step back, as if needing space to process what he just heard. This can't be true. Emily she never told me anything about a daughter. Sophie wipes away a tear that escapes her face. She left me with another family. I grew up hearing that she did it out of love, but I never understood why. Richard feels a mix of emotions, shock, anger, sadness. He looks at Sophie, at the baby in her arms, and back at Emily's photo. Why would she hide this from me? He murmurs, more to himself than to Sophie. Sophie tries to console him, even though she's unsure if she should. I want answers, too. I thought maybe you could help me. Richard takes a deep breath, trying to regain control of his emotions. If this is true, then you and I have a lot to talk about. Sophie agrees, though the tension between them is palpable. Richard looks at Daniel, calm in Sophie's arms, and feels a strange new sensation. He still doesn't know what to think, but he realizes this unexpected connection could change everything. As they leave the cemetery together, Richard cannot stop thinking about all the things Emily never told him, and what else might still be hidden in his past. After the shock of the revelation, Richard and Sophie leave the cemetery in silence. Each of them is lost in their own thoughts, trying to process the information that has just come to light. For Sophie, this was an unexpected opportunity to understand more about the mother she never knew. For Richard, it was a deep blow to learn that Emily had kept such a significant secret. When they reach the cemetery gates, Richard finally breaks the silence. Where are you staying? He asks directly. Sophie looks at him, surprised by the question. In a small apartment. It's not much, but it gets us by. Richard studies her for a moment, assessing her answer. You can't keep living like this, especially with a baby. Do you have family? Anyone who can help? I have no one, Mr. Lawson, Sophie replies, holding Daniel closer. It's just me and him. It always has been. The sincerity in her voice hits Richard hard. He exhales deeply, struggling with the mix of emotions he feels. Come with me. What? Sophie asks, clearly caught off guard. Come with me. There's more than enough space in my house for you and my grandson. The words, my grandson, feel strange even to Richard, but he knows he has to say them. Sophie hesitates, suspicious. I don't know if that's a good idea. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm offering help, Richard says firmly. Consider it an opportunity to learn more about your mother. Sophie looks at Daniel, then at Richard. She knows she doesn't have many options, but even so, her pride and fear leave her unsure. Fine, just for a while. Richard signals for his driver, who has been waiting nearby, to approach. He opens the car door for Sophie, who hesitantly gets in with Daniel. Richard follows her, and the car heads toward the mansion. When they arrive, Sophie is struck by the grandeur of the place. The tall gates open slowly, revealing an expansive garden and a mansion that looks like something out of a movie. "Do you live here alone?" Sophie asks as she gets out of the car, still holding Daniel. "For years now," Richard replies, his tone melancholic. He guides her inside, where the spacious hallways, adorned with expensive art, feel more like a museum than a home. Sophie looks around cautiously while Richard calls for a housekeeper to prepare a guest room for her and Daniel. "You and the baby can stay in the guest room upstairs. It's spacious and has everything you need." Sophie looks at him, still wary. "Thank you." "This means a lot." Richard nods slightly and walks away, heading to his study. He needs a moment to organize his thoughts. In the guest room, Sophie lays Daniel down and looks around. The room is more luxurious than any place she's ever lived in, but it doesn't feel entirely comfortable. There's a weight in the air, as if the walls are filled with stories she doesn't yet understand. Later that night, as Sophie sits in the room with Daniel, Richard appears at the door. "May I come in?" "Of course." Richard enters and looks at Daniel, who is playing with a small toy Sophie brought. For the first time, Richard really looks at the boy, studying his features. He feels something strange and unexpected, a mix of tenderness and responsibility. "He looks like you," Sophie says, smiling softly. Richard doesn't respond immediately. He simply nods, still processing what it means. "Sophie," he begins hesitantly, "I never knew Emily was pregnant. If I had known—" "Do you think she would have told you?" Sophie interrupts, her tone slightly bitter. "She must have had a reason to hide it from you." Richard looks at her, surprised by her bluntness. "Maybe, but that doesn't change the fact that now we have to deal with this together." Sophie takes a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation. "I want to understand what happened too. My whole life I felt like something was missing. Now, being here, maybe this is a chance to fill that void." Richard nods, sensing an unexpected connection with Sophie. In the days that follow, Sophie starts to adjust to life in the mansion, but she still feels like she's intruding on a space that doesn't belong to her. Richard, on the other hand, tries to bond with Daniel, offering small acts of kindness, such as toys and time in the garden. In a touching moment, Richard finds Daniel in the garden, laughing as he tries to chase a bird perched on a low branch. He watches the scene for a moment before approaching. "He seems happy," Richard says as he crouches next to Daniel. "He's just a baby. He doesn't understand life's complications yet." Sophie responds from a distance. "Maybe that's a good thing," Richard replies with a faint smile. As the days pass, the bond between Richard, Sophie, and Daniel begins to grow stronger. Meanwhile, the shadows of the past still linger over them. Sophie discovers more of Emily's letters among Richard's belongings, some mentioning the difficult decisions she had to make. When Sophie reads the letters with Richard, he realizes there was so much about Emily he never knew. The pain of not fully knowing her runs deep, but at the same time, he begins to understand that Sophie and Daniel are extensions of the love he and Emily once shared. At the end of this part, Richard watches Daniel sleeping in Sophie's arms and whispers, "Maybe in the end, she knew what she was doing." Sophie looks at him, saying nothing, but feeling for the first time in a long while that she is beginning to find a place where she belongs. In the days that follow, the Lawson mansion feels less cold and silent. Daniel's laughter echoes through the hallways, breaking the stillness that once dominated the space. Sophie still feels out of place amidst the luxury, but she begins to see that Richard, behind his rigid exterior, is a man deeply marked by pain and regret. Richard, in turn, feels an unexpected change within himself. Every moment he spends observing Sophie and Daniel brings him closer to a new reality. He starts to see Daniel as a second chance, not just to be part of something meaningful, but to repair the mistakes of the past. One clear morning, Richard finds Sophie in the garden, sitting under a tree with Daniel in her lap. He hesitates for a moment before joining her. "It's been years since I've been out here," Richard comments, looking around. Emily loved this place. She used to say the garden was the soul of the house." Sophie smiles faintly, stroking Daniel's hair. "It's beautiful, peaceful, Richard sits beside her, folding his hands over his knees. I don't know if I've said this before, but I'm sorry for everything you've been through. If I had known, if she had told me. Do you think she would have? Sophie interrupts, looking at him with understanding. She must have had her reasons for keeping it from you. Richard stares at her, surprised by her candor. Maybe, but that doesn't change the fact that now we have to figure this out together. Sophie exhales deeply, feeling the gravity of the moment. I want to understand what happened too. My whole life I've felt like something was missing. Now, being here, maybe this is a chance to fill that gap. Richard nods, feeling an unexpected connection with Sophie. Over the next few days, Richard makes a greater effort to bond with Daniel. He spends hours with the boy in the garden, telling stories and laughing at his clumsy attempts to walk. Sophie watches from a distance, smiling as she sees Richard transforming before her eyes. At the same time, Sophie begins to feel more at ease in the mansion. She explores the rooms, uncovering more about Emily and Richard's life together. During one of these explorations, she finds an old journal of Emily's hidden among the books in the library. The journal reveals Emily's true feelings about her decision to leave Sophie to be raised by another family. She describes the anguish of hiding the pregnancy from Richard and her hope that one day Sophie would understand her choices. Sophie reads the words with tears in her eyes, finally understanding the depth of Emily's sacrifice. She shows the journal to Richard, who is also deeply moved. She never told me about this journal, Richard murmurs, running his fingers over the cover. But it makes sense. Emily always kept her deepest feelings to herself. Maybe she knew we'd find it together someday, Sophie suggests, offering a gentle smile. Later that afternoon, Richard proposes something that surprises Sophie. I want to do something in memory of Emily, something that brings our stories together, not as an ending, but as a new beginning. What do you have in mind? Sophie asks, curious. Richard leads her to the garden and points to an empty spot near Emily's favorite tree. I want to plant a tree, something that will grow over time as a symbol of everything we've shared. You, me, and Daniel. Sophie is touched by the idea and immediately agrees. The next day, they plant the tree together, with Daniel watching closely. As they work the soil, Richard talks about Emily with more lightness, as if he's finally finding the peace he's been searching for. She always said I was good at building things, but I never thought I could build something as meaningful as this. By the end of the day, the tree is planted, and the sun sets on the horizon, casting golden tones over the garden. Sophie watches Richard, who holds Daniel in his arms, and realizes that this man, once so distant, is now someone she feels she can rely on. Thank you for everything, Richard, she says sincerely. Richard smiles, looking at Sophie and then at Daniel. Don't thank me. In the end, I think I'm the one who gained the most. The story ends with Richard, Sophie, and Daniel together in the garden, gazing at the new tree they've planted. A symbol of renewal, love, and hope.